Hello there. Thank you for registering for this webinar, and welcome on behalf of Prometeia to our new session dedicated to sectoral economic analysis and how this translates to regulatory-driven credit risk management tools and also business opportunities. This will also be the opportunity to present you the head of Prometeia's new branch in Vienna, that will oversee the operations in Austria and other Central and Eastern Europe countries, to which this analysis is dedicated in the first place. So I immediately introduce and thank Gerald Hessenberger, associate partner and head of the new branch in Austria. Welcome, Gerald. Welcome on board.
Thank you, Massimo. Happy to be here.
And let me introduce the other speaker for today, Andrea Dossena. We unfortunately cannot see him for some technical reasons. Principal within the industrial sector analysis practice at Prometeia. Andrea, in a second, will illustrate the sectoral economic scenario we have right now, with a focus, as I said, on Austria, Germany, and other nearby countries, and discuss the centrality of the sectoral component in a scenario definition, as the many recent asymmetrical shocks put in evidence. The floods in Emilia-Romagna, the place of origin of Prometeia, for example, can be a further example. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Massimo. Good morning to everybody.
So the session will be around 45 minutes. We'll save some time in the end to take some of your questions, which you can write down in the dedicated section of the platform. For all other inquiries, of course, feel free to contact us at risk.community@prometeia.com or the newly inaugurated address austria@prometeia.com. So let's start immediately with Andrea Dossena. I'll meet you later. So please, Andrea, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Massimo. Can you see my screen?
Yes, please go on.
Okay, so I go in presentation mode. Now we will focus on the sectoral analysis from an economic point of view. Then we will see in the next presentation the implication for banks. So as you can see, we have stressed a lot in our titles over the sector word. This is not because Prometeia has been involved in sectoral analysis for more than 30 years, but mainly this is because the last crisis, the last global event, have highlighted the role of sectoral traits in measuring the effects over companies' profitability and riskiness. So if we think about the input mix or the energy and labor intensity, the integration in the global value chains, these are all sectoral information that can amplify the macro scenario effect on companies. So this is more true when we deal with long-term scenarios or trend, like the green transition is, where a country-flat approach could be misleading and not show all the real effects over economy. Moreover, last but really not least, banks' regulatory framework is stressing about the sector relevance. So we have seen in the last 3 stress test exercises different sector focus related to the kind of stress. And if at the beginning with the COVID stress, the sectors were only the focus of the analysis, from the 2022 climate stress test, sectors also became an input provided by ECB to stress banks' balance sheets. So Prometeia experience is mainly based on Central and Eastern Europe, but more geography are coming in the next month. In this presentation, we will focus mainly on Austria and Germany, but all the analysis you will see can be enlarged to all the countries of Europe and not only Europe. So just to start, a quick view to the recent economic history of Austria and Germany. They are quite similar in the last years, but we see that Austria is more volatile during the last crisis. Volatile, but with a stronger and full recovery of the losses in 2020. And this was thanks to all the final demand components. If we look also at the financial information about companies within Austrian and German sectors, we can see different trends in the two countries. Especially we see that German companies suffered the most from the crisis, with an increase in 2020 of the credit riskiness. However, in both countries, also thanks to some financial moratoria, debts moratoria, the financial exposure of company has reduced, and so we have a creditworthiness improvement in 2021. By the way, the different crises had different transmission channel. Here we see the one related to international trade and the Russia-Ukraine war. As we can see from the figures, both Austria and Germany reduce their exposure to Russia and Ukraine after the 2014 crisis. So on the average for the whole economy, these two markets were not so important at the beginning of the new war. But if we deep dive into sectors, we can see some sector with very high exposure to these two countries. So mainly agri-food and machinery for Austria and Germany are sectors most exposed to Russian and Ukrainian markets, and also some specialization emerged, like chemicals for Austria and automotive components for Germany. On the other side, if we look at the relevance of import of Austria and Germany from Russia and Ukraine, we can see that mining products, basic metals and steel, and all the wood value chain were the main products imported from Russia and Ukraine. So this has caused a higher problem for Austria and Germany. Of course, when thinking about Russia, we have the problem related to energy, since Europe is mostly dependent on Russian oil, with a strong difference from other international areas like North America and Asia. And so this was a real issue for all Europe and so also for Austria and Germany. What happened to sectors turnover during the crisis? Well, actually, we can see that after the microchip crisis of the last year, automotive, machinery, and electric and electronic have shown the best recovery from 2020 minimum, while industry related to Russia-Ukraine supply, chemicals, wood, mining, suffer the most intense reduction at the beginning of 2023 and the lowest recovery from 2020. So we see that behind a similar and flat homogeneous trend for Austria and Germany, sectors have shown really strong differences. What is happening outside of manufacturing? Well, in both countries, we see that finally tourism has recovered from COVID, but only at the end of 2022, with logistic and ICT that highlighted a strong growth trend. Trade is suffering for inflation, both in Austria and Germany. And there are strong differences for construction, with a constant growth in Austria and a stability, a decline in the last quarter for Germany. So also projection for the next years are really different for the two countries, with just a deceleration, but then a recovery for Austrian economy, and a risk of stagflation, so high inflation and no growth for Germany, which is not a new information, because this risk is present from some years. So when dealing with sectors, of course, we have to think not only to the short-term scenario, but also to mid-long-term trend in global and local economy. Green transition maybe is the most important of this scenario, with the implication related to GHG greenhouse gases emissions and technology development. So just a few figures to show you the different trends related to different intensity of green transition, from the best one for the climate changes, the net zero scenario, to the worst one, which is the current policies scenario, where we would suffer a lot from physical risks related to climate change. So why is important the sectoral point of view for this kind of analysis? At the beginning, I was talking about the energy input mix, and we can see that there are strong differences between Austria and Germany, and so between their economic sectors. In Austria, we see that the share of renewables has doubled in the last 50 years. In Germany, we still see a very high share of coal, and coal together with oil still account for half of the energy input for the German economy. We can see the very different situations also in other countries of the Central Eastern Europe, from Serbia with over 70% of input represented by coal and oil, to Hungary, where just 55% of input is represented by coal and oil. So this means for this country very different cost in terms of green transition in the next years. Coming back to Austria and Germany, this is a measure of the energy intensity of different sectors. As you can see, the ranking of sector is quite similar. You have to think that technology tends to be similar between Austria and Germany, but we can see relevant differences in some industries. On average, basic metals, paper and printing production, and of course coke and refining are the most energy intensive sectors. So by using the global scenarios for Austria and Germany and applying hypotheses about the cost of emissions, the so-called carbon tax or the emission trade system within Europe, and estimating the level of investments that companies will have to do in order to reduce their emissions in coherence with a different scenario, we can estimate also the total cost of the green transitions for Austrian and German companies. As you can see, the general trend is quite similar because it is determined by the high share of low-emitting sectors like services and trade. But as we can see in the next slide, sectoral effects are really heterogeneous. So we have that the production of cement, ceramic, glass could suffer the higher cost of the green transitions, transition, but also agriculture, air transport, energy distribution would suffer from the transition. So how this is important in terms of sector and companies' riskiness and credit worthiness. Of course, the higher cost for the transition have an impact over the financials of companies, and you can see the different trends following the different scenarios for Austria and Germany. Here you see a synthetic risk indicator that we usually adopt in order to give a synthetic measure of credit riskiness of companies and sectors. What we can see is that, oh, sorry, you don't see the legend of the figures, but the net zero scenario, the blue lines, after higher costs at the beginning of the period will guarantee better financial conditions for corporates, for companies at the end of the simulation, and better for Austrian versus Germany economy. Worst results are expected for the delayed transition, the green lines, with a very high peak of costs during the 30s that could not be recovered before then 2050. Again, the average trend is really different among sectors. Here, oh, sorry. Here you can see the sector that could suffer the higher credit worthiness deterioration under the net zero scenario. You see that air transport, energy, refining are among the most impacted sectors in both countries. In Austria, we see that also non-metallic minerals, glasses, ceramic, and so on, and land transport will suffer severe transitions cost. In Germany, we have mining and agriculture. So these are only some of the examples that a sectoral approach can highlight when dealing with scenario, credit risk, and so on. And this is why we think from the 90s of the last century that the sectoral approach is the best one in order to evaluate the real conditions of companies within a country and within sectors. So this is the end of my...
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Let's stay a bit longer on this slide so that people can take a look at the variety and width of services that your research team can offer. Before leaving the stage to Gerald, as I said, the head of the newly inaugurated Austrian branch, will deep dive about the implications of the sectoral analysis to credit risk measurement and management of banks' portfolio, and so what Prometeia can offer in this domain. So thank you again, Andrea. Gerald, I'm giving you the control of the slides right now, and we'll meet you later for a few questions in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. What I would like to draw your attention to now is how can the very fundamental and broad research work that was just presented be incorporated into the bank's everyday dealing with regulatory pressure and regulatory requirements from the reporting side around credit risk and ESG scenarios. So first of all, the relevance of what we have just seen is given by the pure fact that there's a couple of regulations out there that explicitly ask for sectoral considerations. One of those is in the reporting requirement section of the stress test, of the 2023 stress test methodological note, stating that exposure referred to economic sectors should be explicitly mentioned in the reporting. Another one is in the projected point in time parameters section of the same note, which explicitly asks for banks to have models and to rely on their sectoral models for the projections. So this is the model development perspective. And then finally, when it comes to the scenarios, there is also inside the guidance that has been emitted by the EBA on the stress, explicitly asked for incorporation of industry sectors in order to be able to have a distinguished view of the credit risk when projecting it out. So I think I need not convince the audience that this is a really useful part of information that should be further considered. To give you a very practical example, let's assume we do have a portfolio of various different sector companies and look at the exposure as well as the probability of default. So we have two portfolios, same total, but different constituent percentages. So the left one, if you wish, is more dominated by food and beverage and healthcare. The right one is more dominated by transportation. If you assume for a moment that the point in time probability of default is 2% in all the cases, for the sake of the argument, and if you also have the obvious PD model that is able to calculate the probability of default within 1 year, and we've given the examples here in the column PD satellite model, then with this constitution of the portfolio, we would end up very closely. So we would end up by a probability of default on the left side by 2.9%, on the right side 3.1%, which means there's almost no difference in the two portfolios, despite the fact that the two portfolios are really differently put together or consisting of different sectors when it comes to the weights of the portfolio. However, if you are able to incorporate results from a sectoral research and from modeling along sectoral considerations, then the projected PD per sector would be totally different. And this is given in the most right column of the two examples. And here we see we end up in a real big difference of the right portfolio, which we called the bad one, and the left portfolio, which is called the good one, purely due to the fact that we have the distinction of the sectors. So we end up in 2.2 versus 3.4, as opposed to the previous calculation, which was very close to each other. So that means incorporating sectoral information can help you also with the aspect of a greener portfolio, with the aspect of reporting of ESG relevant figures and general credit risk aspects to distinguish in a much more granular and better way when it comes to regulatory requirements. If you go to the next page, this is a real example with Austrian data. So the colleagues have had a look to the baseline as well as the adverse scenario given by the regulation. And all of a sudden, you see a nice distinction between the various sectors grouped by the NACE code. And I just want to point out here the highest ones, or the ones with the biggest adverse movement from the base scenario. Two of them are the C-low manufacturing and C-high manufacturing, so to say the energy intensive and the low energy manufacturing areas. One other is the transportation area, and the fourth one is the professional, scientific and technical activities. So this reflects what Andrea has presented before in some aspects, but it also gives you a very detailed view how would the stress test that is given by the regulators cumulatively end up 3 years from starting point when we look to the different scenarios. So this distinction is very valuable if you have to decide on the constituents of your portfolio. The other side aspect that is shown here is that the inflation here based on the Austrian Consumer Price Index in an adverse scenario even goes up by 5%. I do not want to defend the baseline figure of 13.5. This is due to the given scenarios by the regulators. It might be slightly too high. So this is something that is, if you wish, an inconsistency in the given scenarios that was rolled out last year, 13.5, even if Austria has a high inflation at the moment, seems to be overdone. But what is important here, in the adverse case, given the different economic areas of Austria, we would end up, and this is also based on the detailed sectoral considerations, by an increase of the inflation. So this means inflation higher for longer would be the adverse scenario given by the current situation of the Austrian industry, as well as the distinction of the different sectors when looking to the 3 years cumulative adverse growth, or in this case, not growth. It is also clear, given what Andrea has discussed before, that we are able to consider comparisons between different European countries. We have big tier Austria versus Italy because clearly, as shown before, we are covering a lot of different countries for the sake of comparison, and also the fact that Italy is not so far from its industrial constitution, if you wish, in comparison to Austria, also Central Europe with a lot of industry in the north at least. Nevertheless, what you see here are some nice possibilities to distinguish between the two countries. For example, the energy intensive sector is even much worse in Italy. Transportation is almost the same, and we do have other points of distinction. For example, in the construction area, Austria seems to be less hidden by the stresses than Italy, which is the box with the letter F. So this is just an example, but if you are having an international portfolio of credit, of loans, then you can do this distinction very easily and also see where you should put your focus, where you should put your attention to when it comes to the stress tests, and even in a further consideration when it comes to the optimization of the portfolio. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the approaches. How could banks make their models fit for the sectoral considerations or for the sectoral model enhancements? Generally spoken, we do see two different approaches, which we have been dealing a lot with big clients in Europe. For example, on the left-hand side, this is a very often happening approach. There are the traditional satellite models that are able to calculate the PD given on the granularity, and those models then can be adjusted in order to be able to incorporate the sectoral assumptions. Not as frequent as approach 1 is approach 2, that there are really sectoral satellite models already existing that have to be calibrated. Also here, the analysis functionality, the research, as well as the provided platforms that Prometeia has, can help, and we have also proven that with clients in order to improve the sectoral satellite models with the right figures derived from the original stress test scenarios coming from the ECRB. So what are the 5 main toolkits or approaches that we are looking at here? If you look to the left side, we do have an issue, for example, that the regulatory stress test scenarios are lacking variables. So there is just missing granularity when it comes to the stress test scenarios. We call that the macro scenario extension. And the approach here is that we put this into a deterministic scenario generator, link it to the few variables, if you wish, few under quotation marks by ECRB, and based on model transmission mechanisms, return coherent paths of all the missing target variables. This is one thing that can be done in order to enhance the richness of the scenarios. Secondly, and this is really important to get a certain degree of details, especially when it comes to big clients, to lump sum exposures or to big portfolios, we are able to do a bottom-up approach, which means we really look to the single company's balance sheet, project the corporate's balance sheets out, put that into a scenario-dependent simulation engine, and are able to aggregate by sector, be it the industry or be it NACE. The third one is a sectoral exogenous variable toolkit. In the case of the lack of turnover or costs for goods and services at nominal prices, which is very often the case when satellite models are calibrated, they need nominal prices. We are able to calculate these variables by making use of the delivered GVAs, the gross value adds, reconciling that with the NACE sectors, calculating by the engine deflators, and then deriving the missing variables like the turnovers and the costs for goods and services. And finally, these two applications are for the fact that if you want to do the detailed default rates calculation, again, you are relying only on given things like the GVAs in the ESRB. So what is important here, in order to have the right granularity, we are able to support and to supply the satellite models, even in the lack of the granularity of sectors, in order to get the default rates really by, be it NACE 1-2 sector or by geography, etc. Making use of both exogenous macro variables as well as exogenous sectoral variables. So that means we are able to enhance the models from this perspective. If I put these 5 applications into the, and that's the last slide I want to share with you, into the functional architecture. That means on one hand side, more than the ESRB scenarios are being used by number two, by the enhancement by this bottom-up approach. And then we enrich the macro exogenous variables as well as the sectoral variables by the approaches 1 and 3, and then are able to do the right PD calculation for both cases, for both approaches, by bringing the banking's satellite models up speed based on either the NACI or sectoral enhancements. So that's in a nutshell the various entry points in such an architecture in order to be able to incorporate considerations from a sectoral perspective into modeling, into credit risk, as well as ESG considerations.
Thank you, Gerald, for this interesting contribution. We still have some minutes for a few questions that have come by in the meanwhile, but I would stick with you, Gerald, since you know the Austrian branch of Prometeia has been born like 2 months ago. One very practical question that has arrived says, are you providing services and solutions with a German-speaking team? So take this chance maybe to illustrate what is going to be the operation of Prometeia in the region.
It's a good question. Thank you. Yes, first of all, we have opened the branch April 1st, and we are in the course of building up a team. That means there is growth perspective on what the size of the team is belonging to. On the other hand, we do have local partners to be able to immediately start also projects with German-speaking resources, beside the experts that we bring in from our headquarters, from our research team, from our modeling team, which is always a good basis to work on. And we already do have projects in Austria that are staffed with our experts from Italy. And as I said, this will be then just a blend of people from our new branch, as well as cooperation partners, because sometimes there are already established partners of various banks, and then they nevertheless want to bring in our expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, and glad to see in the end at least Andrea as well on camera. Thank you, Andrea, for this. A couple of questions to you as well. One asked if the results you displayed, Andrea, are from NFS or are data elaborated by Prometeia? If you could please clarify this.
Yes, thank you for the question. And in the example, only the macroclimate variables like emissions and carbon tax were from the NGFS scenario, while all the sectoral forecast and the single company balance sheet forecast derived from Prometeia proprietary models.
Okay, thank you. And another very practical question goes, what geographies can you cover with your analysis? And I add, with which level of details in terms of micro sectors or even supply chains? Andrea.
Yes. Actually, we can apply this methodology to basically to all Europe, all European countries, but we are also working with North Africa and Middle East country. But from a theoretical point of view, the methodology can be applied to every country. For the sectoral deep dive, usually we rely on NACE two-digit classification, so we can aggregate this classification, but for some specific sector, we could also have a more wide disaggregation of information.
I think we can go towards the end of this interesting session. So thanks again to Andrea Dossena, principal within the industrial sector analysis practice at Prometeia. Thank you, Andrea. See you next time.
Thank you, Massimo, and thanks to all.
And thanks to Gerald Hessenberger, associate partner and the head of the newly inaugurated Austrian branch in Vienna of Prometeia. Thank you, Gerald.
Thank you. I wanted to mention to the audience that we will send out the material. So just in case there are additional questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Yes, of course, feel free to get in touch with us should you need more information about our solutions and our activity in Austrian and German speaking markets, writing at risk.community@prometeia.com or austria@prometeia.com. You will now see a very brief evaluation survey on this session. Please take a few seconds to fill it. It is very important to us, and you will, as Gerald said, shortly receive an email with the video recording and the slides presented during this session. That's all. Don't forget to follow us on www.prometeia.com and our LinkedIn account as well. So stay tuned for our next activities and webinars. So thank you all again, and goodbye.